Hey, what's going on, guys? So the other day, I had a really great question from Connor here on one of my videos asking about this strategy of rebalancing, right? So let's take a look here. He is in a wrap BTC and ETH pool, pulling about 20 to 30% APR, which is really solid for a blue chip asset. This is probably because the range is pretty tight, right? And using a max and low point to set the range that has been active for the past 90 days. I personally like to use at least 6 to 12 months when it comes to setting a price range. But for ETH to BTC, I guess it's less volatile. So if you had a tighter range, it would have done pretty well in the last couple of months, right? If we pull out the ETH BTC chart, you can see it's just been kind of grinding sideways in this zone here. But the tough part is you never know when it's going to start trending again, right? If ETH starts trending against BTC, either to the upside or to the downside, that's where you see a lot of impermanent losses. And so it's really hard to predict if prices are going to just grind sideways for like a few months at a time, or if it's going to go up and go down. So that's one component of it, of the question. But what he's basically doing here is he's rebalancing when the price is moving towards an 80% allocation, right? So assuming that you start with a 50 to 50 allocation or a 60 to 40 allocation. So if one of the asset, if ETH is going to 80%, you're rebalancing back to 60% ETH and 40% wrap BTC, right? Maybe price in either BTC terms or in dollar terms. You're kind of adjusting the allocation along the way. If it's hitting an 80% allocation, you're rebalancing there, right? So that's the trigger. And then the strategy is to get back to a 60 to 40% allocation. So he's asking if he's missing anything. This is a really great question. And this is really important to know before you actually dive into LPing and before you use like a tight range strategy, right? Because a lot of times, if you don't know how to manage a tight range strategy, it could just end up losing you more assets than what you earn in the yield. I've seen it all the time where people just LP and then after a year, they end up with much less than what they started out with, even though the prices have just been kind of grinding for the entire year, right? So we don't want that to happen. That is a result of a bad strategy. It is understandable that your portfolio is down if the underlying asset is down. But if the underlying asset is moving sideways, but your portfolio is down, then it's a sign that the strategies you're running is not working, right? We want to make sure that our portfolio is grinding up in value if these assets are moving sideways. But ideally, if it's trending up, your portfolio is trending up as well. So what Connor essentially is doing is actually a range chasing strategy. And I've talked about the range chasing strategy multiple times on my channel. But basically what you're doing here is very similar to what a lot of beefy pools do. They set a range, right? And then as prices hit the edge of the range, they rebalance to chase the range up and down. You can see here, ETH price actually has not moved that much, right? About a year ago, it's trading at around 32.97. Right now, it's at around 2,800, 2,750. So about like a 20% drop, right? So this is the ETH price. But if I go to the LP price here, which shows us the LP performance, right? You can see that if there's other rewards, then you have to claim it separately. Like if there's a Merkle reward, incentive rewards. But if we're just looking at trading fees alone, you can see it's compounded regularly back into the pool. And when you see that after compounding, the prices of this LP has just been declining, almost a 50% loss here. The reason why is the range they set is quite aggressive, especially on a very volatile pair like a crypto to stable pool, even with stuff like Ethereum or even BTC. If you're doing a range chasing strategy, the chances are you're going to lose money long term, right? And maybe the rewards that you would get would outweigh the impermanent loss you suffer. But I highly doubt it. In a lot of cases, you're not going to be gaining like, hundreds of percents of APR. And you guys could compare like a bunch of different pools on Beefy and see the results, right? Like for example, this ETH to USDT on Arbitrum on PancakeSwap is supposedly generating a 51% APR. And most of it is from trading fees, and the trading fees do get compounded, right? And you can see that the price again for ETH over the last year has not moved that much, maybe like 20% down or so. but you can see the price of the LP is down pretty significantly, about like 40% or so. So that is quite a huge drop, 30-40% compared to just holding ETH in the market. And if you just stake ETH, you would have gained some staking fees at least. Or if you set a wide range LP, you would have done likely quite well if you just kind of sat on your hands and don't do any rebalancing. So rebalancing, if you're not doing it correctly, could be a really costly mistake for a lot of LPs. And you can see there's still like a couple $100,000 on these pools. And if we go to the Beefy page and just look for ETH and USD, right? On the higher total value lock one, sometimes there's like 500,000 or even upwards of $1 million or more before I started making these videos on these beefy pools, right? So at least some people are catching on that, okay, some of these strategies are not sustainable, and I have nothing against beefy. I think it's a great platform. But if you are using it for volatile pairs, you have to be really, really careful because a lot of times these pools could actually underperform manual management by quite a huge margin, right? And I'll explain that in a little bit on like the ETH and wrap Bitcoin. But let's just use ETH to USDC just as an easy example so that it's easier to understand. And then we're going to apply the same exact concept on ETH to wrap Bitcoin, right? And I love making these videos because it would protect you from actually doing these mistakes that would cost you thousands of dollars down the line if you don't understand it and you spend a bunch of time managing your position. You're not going to be only losing your capital, you're also losing your time and kind of your peace of mind with it, right? So let's just say we are in an ETH to USDC pool here, and then let me pull up this Desmos calculator, and I will pull up an ETH to USDC simulation here that I have created. And let's just say I put in 100K just to make the numbers easier. And then I want to have my price deposit. Let's just say we entered at $3,000, right? Just to make the numbers more simple. And then the price now is at $3,000 as well. And then let's just say we set a 20% wide range on each side, right? So minus 20% and then plus 20%. So that is about like 2,400 here on the lower side and then around 3,600 here on the upper side. So I already consider this a pretty tight range for a ETH to USDC pool. And a lot of people do go tighter than this, like those beefy pools. And if you're rebalancing all the time, it could actually get you into a ton of trouble, right? So right off the bat, you could see that, okay, the allocation of ETH is about 45.2%. This is this X value here. As the price move up, the X value would drop, right? And then the Y value, about 80% here is the USDC. So let's go back to the question that Connor asked. So if one of the assets shifts towards 80%, and let's just say it's going to the upside, right? Let's say ETH moves up to about 33.40. And here you can see USDC is about 80-81%, right? Like that trigger for rebalancing that Connor was talking about. And then he's going to shift back to a 60-40 allocation for ETH and USDC, right? So let's think about the concepts really quickly, right? So position one, we are depositing at 3,000, price move to 33.40, and then LP value went from 100K to, let's see how much it is. If we click on this dot, it's about 103,546, right? But basically what is happening behind the scenes is that your ETH is being sold to USDC, right? And then if you're rebalancing closer to a 60-40 ratio, like what Connor is doing, then you are basically buying more ETH at a higher price, right? Because if you think about it, you're already holding 80% USDC and then 20% ETH. If you want to swap it back to some ETH, either like let's say 40% ETH and 60% USDC, then you're forced to buy some ETH at a higher price than your entry, right? So let's see what happens here if I rebalance here at 33.40. So let me just deposit here again, 33.40. And we have to go back and change the LP value here to be 103,546. So let's say 103,546 here. Basically, this is the new range and the new deposit. And if the range stays the same, then the deposit ratio is exactly the same, right? Because it's the same position. I haven't really adjusted my ratio. And let's just say I want to move up a little bit, the price lower to maybe 2,700, price upper to 3,700. So if I just track the range a little bit, then I'm not really close to the 60 to 40 ratio, right? So then let's move up a little bit, maybe 2,800 to 3,800, about $1,000 wide range, right? So this is pretty close to a 60 to 40 ratio here. So about 60% of USDC and 42, 43% of ETH, right? And again, you can adjust your ratio to what you want. But let me just go over the concept. Let's just say the price continues higher to 3,500. At that point in time, you're not suffering any losses, right? Because if you look at the LP value here, you're still in profit. It's still at 105K, 106K. We move a little bit further here, again, to this 80 to 20% ratio, right? So then as the price move up, then you're forced to rebalance once again. When we're rebalancing again, we have to do the same process again, right? So let's do a quick recap, right? Position two, depositing at 33.40, and then price move to about 35.80, right? And then LP value would go from 103,546 to about 105,832 here. So you're gaining a little bit of money. This is still all good. And then you're forced to rebalance once again, right? Because you might not want to get out of range. And then you want to get back to that 40 to 60 ratio. So then we want to copy this price now to this price deposit. We want to make sure that we are changing this LP value here because that's the new LP value when we rebalance, right? And then let's just say we want to go again to about a 40 to 60 ratio. So let's say I move the lower price to about 3,000 and then maybe upper price about 4,000. So that's pretty close to a 40 to 60 ratio here. And again, if prices move up, let's say to 4,000, you're still in profit, right? Even though you missed out on some of the gains because of impermanent loss, it's not a big deal because you're earning cash flow. That is the main goal with a lot of the liquidity providing, especially for a tighter ETH to USDC pool, right? You're going to be missing out on some capital gains anyway. So far, so good if prices trend up, right? But let's just say the price whipsaws back to the original position, which is the price deposit here at $3,000, right? Because we started at $3,000, the first rebalance price is at 33.40. We went back to the 60-40 ratio, right? And then the second rebalance is at 35.80. We basically rebalanced twice, but let's just say the price drops all the way to $3,000. Here is what you're going to notice, right? You're going to notice the capital now drops all the way to $93,689. So that's a pretty big loss here, about a 6.47% loss. So that's not insignificant, right? Especially if the yield are lower or if you're not actually in range for long enough to cover that loss, then you're kind of giving back a lot of the gains versus if you just sat tight in your range at $3,000 and did nothing, you would still have 100K and then whatever fees you've earned throughout the whole process. So the reason why this happens is because as you're rebouncing up, you're essentially buying more ETH at a higher price. And then as price whipsaws back, then you're actually losing capital in the process because you bought more ETH at a higher price, right? So hopefully that makes sense. And chances are if prices do trend up pretty aggressively or whipsaws back and forth pretty aggressively, you're going to be incurring much, much more impermanent loss than what you would be earning in fees. That's why the beefy pools are unprofitable. And that's why a lot of tight range liquidity providers are unprofitable. So this is the main drawback when it comes to using this strategy. And we don't really have to run through like the entire math again with E to BTC. Just know that the concept is exactly the same, except now you are using BTC instead of US dollar, right? So you could think about your LP value in BTC terms. If this chart is going up, it means ETH is outpacing BTC. You are actually selling some ETH for some BTC. And then when you're rebouncing up or down to chase the range, you're essentially buying high and then selling low, right? Because if you are rebouncing down to maintain that 60-40 ratio or a 50-50 ratio, whatever you prefer, then you're actually selling low, right? Because as prices go down, you're basically selling your ETH for BTC at a cheap price. And then as prices go up, you're rebuying your ETH at a higher and higher price. So this is actually not a great strategy, especially for a blue chip pair where the yield might not actually be greater than the volatility, right? There is a rare case scenario where this strategy could work is where the asset is trending up or down very slowly and the yield is actually quite high, right? And this doesn't really happen that often at all. So in my opinion, it's just not a great strategy. What I prefer to do instead is to set a wider range, either stay in range for at least 6 to 12 months at a time, or to stay in range for years at a time, right? Some of my pools are full range LPs just because you are going to have less impermanent loss. You don't have to rebalance a lot of times, if you don't know how to simulate your rebalancing, you could lose a ton of money in the process, right? And if you do use a tight range strategy, check out the widen and squeeze strategy that is on my channel. It's showing you how to rebalance without actually locking in impermanent loss. And I know some of the math and concept behind LPs are quite complex. So I am building a few tools with my co-founder at Drippy to make the whole process easier. So you'll be able to see like the profit and loss before you actually rebalance, and then you're going to be able to develop better strategies, and then you'll also have access to all of the strategies that I've developed in the past, right? And lastly, before I hop off here, a lot of times if you are LPing stuff like ETH to BTC, you have to be comfortable actually ending up with one or the other asset if it trends too aggressively. If prices of ETH, for example, outpaces BTC by a lot, you're going to be left with a lot of BTC, and you don't really need to chase the range. You could just withdraw the LP and hold your BTC, because if you are LPing this in the first place, you probably want to have some BTC allocation anyway. And another strategy is using BTC in other ways, right? For example, you could use the bull lever strategy. You could be depositing stuff like the wrap Bitcoin, Coinbase Bitcoin on DeFi platforms like Aave. You borrow USDC against that to yield farm. Or if the prices are really good, you could actually take your BTC and yield farm some BTC to USDC pool, right? When that happens and the prices drop, you're going to be able to earn more BTC as well, because you're rebuying BTC at a lower and lower price if you are entering with BTC, right? There's a ton of flexibility and things you could do with DeFi and yield farming and liquidity pools. Just make sure that you guys know the underlying concepts and what I'm talking about before you actually commit serious capital into it. I've made hundreds of videos on my channel talking about LP and DeFi. Hopefully these videos help you out, and that's why I love making them in the first place. Thank you once again for watching. I'll catch you on the next one.